We are now going to start the second session, which is on China. And we have already alluded to China in the context of global imbalances in the first session, and now we're going to focus squarely on China. And I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. Nowadays, when people talk of China, we tend to focus a lot on the US-China trade tensions and the geopolitical implications of that key bilateral relationship. But I think that China is much more than that. It's a fascinating country with a fascinating story and with a tremendous recent history of success in terms of economic growth and development, and a future that is not going to be exactly like the past, because there are shifting currents in terms of global economic and geopolitical drivers. For this conversation, we have a wonderful set of panelists here, people who come from different backgrounds, which have some common linkages, as you will see, in terms of their experience, but who are going to illustrate us about China. Now, let me just say a few words to frame the conversation, and then we're going to go into a session that I hope would be very interactive among myself and the panelists, among the panelists themselves, and then with you in the audience. So I have asked them to refrain as much as possible, also to compensate a bit with the first session, to use PowerPoint. We had wonderful PowerPoints in the first session, and here we're going to go more on the policy issues, and we're going to make it more of a talkative policy conversation between the panelists, myself and themselves, and with you. And those are the rules of engagement for the session. Now, let me say, just as I said, a couple of things on China. If one looks back to the last 4 years of China, what one can see is the most salient example in history of growth and development in a large economy. An economy that for the last 4 years has been growing at average annual rates of 10%, and which has doubled every 7 to 8 years. That is something that explains what's happened to China since 1979 till the present. Nowadays, one can see that China has benefited tremendously from getting integrated on the trade side in the global economy after the accession to the World Trade Organization. China has benefited a lot from the open multilateral trade system, and also managed to not to be affected too much by the adverse developments in the rest of the world whenever there were significant shocks. And I think that one proof of that was the global financial crisis, where the impact was much less, given the smaller degree of financial integration, in particular of China vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But also, it's true that there were counter-cyclical measures taken by the Chinese authorities that helped insulate China. And nowadays, China is no longer the developing economy it was 4 years ago. It's an emerging market in the traditional classification of the IMF, for example, but it's really a country which has emerged as a top economic and global superpower. And that brings us into the present, where there is an issue between the United States and China in terms of trade, which, as we know, goes beyond trade, goes into technology, but also onto other aspects which have more to do with the natural tension that emerges over time between the incumbent superpowers and the emerging superpowers, something that has been described beautifully in a recent most read book by Graham Allison of the relationships between the United States and China, in which draws on historical episodes, or whether these tensions between the prevailing superpower and the challenging superpower through history have been resolved in a peaceful and conflictual manner. And what we all hope is that it would be solved in a peaceful manner, but you can see already some tensions emerging. So China has done tremendously well in the past, but it still has a number of important challenges which have to do with needing to continue to rebalance the economy and the country. The economy in terms of the natural shifts from less manufacturing to more services as a share of GDP, credit rebalancing, which is very important, the issue of inequality between the rural and the urban population, and also a rebalancing in terms of the environment. So China needs to move forward towards a more sustainable growth model, which privileges more the quality than the quantity of growth. And I think that this is something which is well understood by the Chinese authorities, but also by all of those who are looking at China and analyzing China. But I think one key thing, being at the Bank of Spain and talking in an institution which has important financial and monetary responsibilities, is how is China process of continuing to integrate into the world economy and financial system is going to proceed over the next decades. And I think that financial integration is something which is critical. I think it's something that, if well done, would be great for China and great for the rest of the world. But that's a process that needs to be traveled in a very skillful manner to combine financial development, opening up and integration together with financial stability. And we have today with us the governor of the People's Bank of China, Governor Gang. So I feel humbled by his presence. So I hope that we can say something which is not too wrong in the eyes of him and the other people in the audience that we have today. So China's future is fascinating in terms of rebalancing, sustainability of growth, integrating into the global financial system, and last but not least, how these geopolitical sort of relationships between China and the United States are going to be managed, and what is the role of other continents like Europe in this equation? What is going to be the future, how the new global governance is going to shape up, and so on. So these are some of the key issues that this panel is going to talk about. And as I said, we have a very distinguished group of panelists, and certainly most of them. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to intervene. And I'm going to ask Jacob to start first, to give a bit of an overview of how he sees China in the context of these global currents, shifting global currents in the world economy. Jacob is a very amazing combination of three things, among others. He's a former central banker. He was the governor of the Central Bank of Israel at a very important time for Israel. He was also a professor at the University of Chicago, and a very influential one. He was the chief economist of the IMF, and he's now the chairman of J.P. Morgan Chase International, and also the chairman of the group, the board of trustees of the group of 30. So it's a combination of academic, policymaker, central banker, and banker that I think would be tremendously inspiring to you. Second speaker is going to be Alicia Garcia Herrero. Alicia has a history in the Bank of Spain, but also in quite a number of other places. Alicia is currently the chief economy for Asia Pacific at Natixis, but before she was with BBVA, also from Hong Kong, where you have been living for quite some time, another fascinating part of the world, which is now a little bit in the newspapers. And Alicia has had also a career in the public sector. In addition to the bank, she's been at the European Central Bank, at the BIS, and at the IMF. So she will provide a unique perspective of the relationships between China and the rest of the world. And I want her also to say something about China and Europe, given that she's also well plugged in Europe through her senior fellowship at Bruegel think tank, and also her association with the Real Instituto Elcano here in Madrid. We also have our colleague from the Reserve Bank of San Francisco, let me say if I pronounce well, Cheng Liu. And Cheng is the director of the Pacific Basin Study Center at the San Francisco Fed. He's also a visiting professor at the Institute for the Shanghai Advanced Institute of Finance. And again, he can provide a good bilateral perspective from the United States, where he works, and also from China. And last but certainly not least, James Daniel. James Daniel is Associate Director at the Asia Pacific Department of the IMF. And more important than that, for this panel, he is the mission chief for China. That means the person at the IMF who has the responsibility for the oversight of China, the one who goes there times a year with his team, who carries out the so-called Article 4, and therefore he can provide a unique position of China. And before that, James was also well known in Madrid because you were the mission chief for Spain at a complicated time, not as complicated as during the crisis, but immediately afterwards. So James also had a lot of work here in Spain and understands also the European perspective. So as you can see, there is a common thread running through this panel. Most people have an affiliation with the IMF sometime in their careers, past or present, and we're going to get started now. So let me turn to Jacob to give the his initial remarks.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here today, especially in this grand building, grand hall, and to be moderated by our dear friend, José Viñal. To moderate us is a contradiction in terms, but we will try the best because we all respect the authority of our great moderator. So much so that at the entrance to this room, he instructed us to forget about, except for one person, forget about PowerPoint presentations and to start talking out of the sleeve. So please, you can turn off this machine. You should know that there has been a great PowerPoint presentation. I would like to start connecting a little bit the discussion of the morning with what you suggested, and I will get eventually to what you want. Two reflections. Reflection number one. When I joined the IMF as a chief economist, it was shortly after the Plaza Agreement and the heydays of policy coordination. Coordination meant only exchange rate policy. In the room, central bank governors did not sit, only ministers of finance. And there were 5 people. The IMF came in, made a presentation, left the room, said to. They got the appetite, it was successful. 2 years after, there was the Louvre Agreement, 87. That's when they started saying, okay, let's coordinate also fiscal policies. That's where problems started to arise. And the notion between coordination and cooperation became very critical. You understood policy is being made at home. There are international consequences. That's why you need to share information, but don't expect that anyone will tell a sovereign country what to do. This is the perspective that I got by the end of the 80s. Second remark. When we were in charge of the World Economic Outlook, we asked always, quo vadis the world? Where does the world go? It was enough to answer to know 3 pieces of information. What about the US? What about Japan? What about then West Germany? 3 numbers, and you knew where the world goes. China was never mentioned. And the world has changed. Why those 3 numbers were enough? Because they produce 65% of world output. Today, these 3, in fact, the entire Europe, US, and Japan together, produce only 35% of world output. Fundamental change in the center of gravity of the world. Where did it all go? It went to emerging markets in general, Asia in particular, and of course, China is the champion. And this brings me now to the question of China, but first I want to emphasize from here that the notion of imbalances was at the beginning not just the gaps between export, imports, current account, surplus or deficit, but also volume of trade, etc. Now we come to today's discussion. China today produces about 1/5 of world output. In 1990, the last WEO that I did, was 4% of world output. Huge change, very few examples in history that did it in this way. Second, trade. Today, everyone looks at the link between China and the US and Europe, and focusing on this. The entire volume of trade between China and US and Europe taken together is about $1.5 trillion. At the same time, the volume of trade between China and the rest of Asia is double that. So if we focus only on one nexus, we know that we miss the important issue, especially that deals with the chain, the production chain and the trading chain. Third, from all of US exports today, 20% goes to China. It was about 5-6% just at the year 2000. From all of European exports today, 25% goes to China. It was, again, 1/5 of it in the year 2000. From all of Chinese exports today, the majority goes to the rest of Asia, and about 20% or whatever goes to Europe and to the US. What does it mean? It means the system is extraordinarily interconnected. And therefore, any implosion will not be contained, especially because of the fact that, and that's where you mentioned earlier, in the morning, the issue of Trump's approach was mentioned. One of the key issues is that when you have a bilateral focus on a multilateral system, you miss the whole side effects and all the chain and all the extraordinary unintended consequences. Fourth, is this an episodic issue? The answer is no, because the fact of the matter is China is saving today twice as much as the US, and also significantly more per saving rate, more than Europe in the same degree. Which means that the issue is much more structural. We can go into the issue of the life cycle savings and all of that, but those are structural issues, clearly not determined by the Fed and probably not by current fiscal policies. Fifth, China has adopted an extraordinary, courageous program of urbanization. For the Chinese authorities, and I'm talking under the control of the governor, for the Chinese authorities, the urbanization program was a centerpiece of the economic development. You cannot have a successful urbanization without providing jobs to those who move to the cities. You cannot have successful provision of jobs without assuring markets to the products of these. If the structure of the economy was lack of domestic demand, you needed to rely on foreign demand. Hence, in fact, the reliance on export markets was a derivative, a corollary of the more fundamental issue of the urbanization, against the background of the fact that there is a structure of demand at home, high saving and all the rest, and in undeveloped financial markets at the time that had to rely on foreign export. The West got very nervous about it, needless to say, not because of thorough economic analysis, and therefore, with communication with the Chinese, at the end of the day, the Chinese growth model has shifted from export-led to domestic demand. With it, therefore, there has been a fundamental decline in China's export surplus. And with it, therefore, the question was, how do you do it to us exactly at the time when we have a slowdown in the economy. So again, tension. And the entire focus of the international tension today has been directed towards the current account, the bilateral one, where the real issue, as you said, Jose, the real issue for real, and for here the US has a serious claim, has done as well as the European, has to do with the intellectual property rights, with the technology transfers, etc. How do you bridge them? You bridge them, first to note that the two countries have different time frame in the focus. At least in the US, we are a year before election. Trump worries about 2019, 2020. The Chinese are guided by, in general, towards the medium term, but there is the China 2025 program. You sit around the table, one worries about 25, one worries about 20. You know that there is already a problem of how do you exchange marbles in this way. But the most important thing is, and we can go later on about the style of negotiations, which is not the best one, especially from the US perspective. But I think that our good friend, Governor Yi Gang, who is so much more informed than anyone else, may be able to say something about it. Let me say, lastly, about demography. Because I think that the point that Guillermo de la Dehesa made this morning was a very important one. And it has dimensions both international and domestic. In China's case, the demographers tell us that between now and the year 2055, namely in the next 30 years or 35 years, the population will actually shrink by about 70 million people. By the way, population in the world will grow up by about 2 billion, all of them in the emerging countries, most of them in Africa. But let's come back to China. China's population will actually shrink by 70 million people. But it will not shrink in a radical way. It will shrink very, very unproportionally. In fact, the age distribution of the changes in the population will be very, very skewed. The only cohorts that will be rising in the next 30 years are the cohorts above 70. Only Japan is worse, which is the cohorts that will rise must be above 80. If you want to have more friends in 30 years, you better be above 80. So basically, we are having both an aging population and somewhat shrinking. That's not a problem of the shrinking. That's a huge country and a huge this. And there was a period in which it was very fashionable to do comparisons between China and India, the two locomotives of Asia. The strong point of India, relatively strong point, has to do with the Gaussian distribution of the age population, which is a very different notion. What does it mean? It means that the focus is going to be very differently. A population that is aging, by definition, is somewhat more, whatever are the attributes of older population when they think about things. But I want to come back to the Guillermo de la Dehesa point. In the US, in the next 20, 30 years, the proportion of people who is going to be above 65 is going to be significantly higher than what it is today. This has been a trend all over. So if you look at the US budget, if you look at the US federal budget, what you see is, whereas today about 50% of the budget of the US goes to healthcare and social security, just because of aging, no other policies, in about 25 or 30 years, 65% of the budget will go for these activities, which means from the entire budget, 35% of the budget will need to be covering infrastructure, defense, research and development, education, you name it, everything that governments do. There is no way that you can square this circle without rewriting the contract between citizens and governments. So the issue about the internal pressure will become very important. Why do I mention this in this context? And here I will be very cynical. The G5 discussion in Plaza and the G7 in Louvre was not intended to improve the behavior of the world. It was the way in which large country, in this case the US, was unable to deal with its excess spending and wanted other countries to pick up the slack. And it put a lot of pressure on Japan, and therefore after the Plaza, Japan went into a decade of a recession because it did what it should not have yielded to in the Plaza. And some of the failures in Louvre or attempts in Louvre were to put pressure on West Germany at the time and on Japan in order to do what the US was unable to do. In other words, the issue is how to induce other countries to do the homework that the large country is unable or unwilling to do. Come back today. Today, again, there are international consequences of what we do, and I think that what Jose said, and here I will conclude, the biggest danger today to the world economy is from the trade area, and not because of the fact that our models show that the implications on growth is dramatic. In fact, it's not. You don't see it in the numbers. And you say, if I don't see it in the numbers, how come I'm so nervous about it? And the reason is that the extraordinary degree of uncertainty that is entering into the economic system will show itself in places and times that you are not ready for. If you're sitting on a plane and you suddenly hear in the loudspeaker that the two co-pilots are fighting with each other, what would you do? You fasten your seatbelt, maybe you start praying, maybe you sit on your hands, maybe you don't think about the investment that you are supposed to do. That's not the time. And I think this phenomenon is starting to show. And those are really the two co-pilots of the largest countries in the world. We need really to make sure that they are doing it together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jacob, for all of this, and we all hope for a smooth landing of that plane. But I think you've put a number of important things on the table that we will come back to. And by the way, I would also like the panelists, if after this first round you have questions or comments on what other panelists have said, to come into that. Alicia.
Thank you, Jose. So for me, this is an amazing opportunity because I learned from global imbalances from Jose 20 years ago when I was working at the bank. And since then, I've been interested in the topic and, of course, in China in particular. So I'm going to start just reviewing something that, Jacob, you mentioned, and we heard in the first session about China no longer being the problem because the current account is shrinking, it's come back up again, and we can talk about that later. But I want to remind the audience that it's not only about the difference between savings and investment, it's really about the level. And we're still very far, and you did mention that point, from any normal number anywhere else in the world. And I think the real issue here is how China brings down that very high level of savings and that very high level of investment, which basically ultimately means lower growth, structurally, but nicely, without basically getting in trouble. And that's really the difficulty that China really needs to navigate. And if not, because the US is making it even harder. So that is the thing. So I think China was in that paradigm through its rebalancing story towards consumption, doing it nicely but slowly. But now those extra savings, and that's why I'm calling that, I actually think we're going to see a reborn current account surplus in China as first line of defense, because you need to keep those savings to basically lower your growth structurally but nicely. And in a way, what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes those imbalances go well beyond the difference between savings and investment. And it's really about how you bring them down nicely, which is very, very hard. And it's proven to be very hard for China. So I'm going to move to the topic you asked me to talk about, which is really about how far has China gone in terms of opening up and reform. And I think I'm going to start by saying that and I'm going to put my European hat here, since I'm the only European in the panel. I think I'm not short. Sorry?
James
Are you European? Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, continental Europe. Sorry, I didn't know that. Very sorry. I think I'm going to start by saying that the story of my life so far has been that I've seen China been disappointed about us, and I would say us mean the West, especially since the global financial crisis. We've all experienced this for the right reasons, probably the way we solved the crisis, what we thought we were, what we weren't, what we became after the crisis, the stubbornly low growth in the world. I mean, the lack of reform, I could go on and on. But I'm going here to talk about why the West is disappointed about China. I'm very sorry but this is what I've been asked to do. And I'm going to separate the two topics, reform and opening up. And I'm going to basically claim that perhaps the world was expecting too much from China in both areas, but that I guess because of where we are today, maybe it's about time for that expectation, no matter how big it was, to actually come to fruition. So that's what I'm going to cover here. So on reform, I think, again, from European, I used to be advisor to the European Commission years ago, and I went through that process of China is not becoming a market economy. The surprise of the trade commissioner at the time, Karl de Gucht, by the fact that he had to take this decision, and he couldn't see that in the numbers in terms of basically share of SOEs in listed companies, assets in listed companies, or many other forms of mixed ownership reform not being what we, with our European hat, thought it was, not real privatization or change really in the functioning of those mixed ownership companies in China. So all of that brought us to this idea that China was still a state-led economy. So this is, again, with the European hat. I think, again, I'm bringing it back to this idea of high savings, high investment, high savings, waiting for consumption to come, waiting for that middle class, waiting for that middle income trap to be breached. And in a way, that model, that five-year plan, that high investment, key sectors, 2025, was a way to bridge that gap. So what I'm trying to say here is that I know that this is hard for us to swallow, that China needs time. We've heard it many times. But I actually agree China needed time to do this because of where it was coming from. And basically to avoid what would have been the collapse, which we learned from the Soviet Union. So that for me was the way to understand why China was doing what it was doing, and why it was hard for us, because we were coming from a crisis, we're coming from lack of demand. We needed China, and we wanted to see those imports from China growing, and we only had this wonderful announcement by President Xi of 30 trillion, up to the 10 trillion today by 2025. But it kind of came late in our understanding of what we could believe, and that's the gap. Yeah, forgetting though that China was in that process of lowering very slowly that saving and investment ratio down the road to a consumption-based economy. The key, though, is that consumption-based economy, though, is open to the world. That's the key question mark that we still have to face. And there, I'm going to move to the opening up part. So beyond reform, which I'm only focusing on SOE reform, obviously. So state-led economy, which is what we always say in Europe. So on the opening up, I think our European vision of the issue is that still very far from what Europeans call open sectors. Yeah, I mean, we have a very small negative list, which is basically just military security, as opposed to the numerous attempts, I must say, that China have actually already conducted of reducing, moving first from a positive list to a negative list, acknowledgedly in Shanghai Free Trade Zone, but then moving beyond to many more areas of the country and reducing that negative list as much as possible. But we all know that it's still far from what we consider a fully open economy, open to foreign competition. Now, is it because China still fears that foreign competition can be harmful? Because, if you don't fear it, you could consider it normal to open up. And I think increasingly China is realizing that for many, many sectors, we have the auto sector recently, a staggered but relevant opening up has been announced, the financial sector. I think China is starting to get confident about its own abilities to withstand foreign competition, which is basically leading that opening up. Yeah. So in the financial sector, I can't agree more with them. Why not open? Nothing's going to change. Why I say that is, first of all, China's banking sector is simply massive. It's close to 300% of GDP. No foreign bank can, frankly, become extremely large in China. The amount of capital you would need with the regulations in place. Even when you look at ROE of Chinese banks, very low. That of foreign banks in China, I must say, even lower, half of what it is on average. Cost to income, basically double of what it is for Chinese banks. So what I'm trying to say, even if you open, I actually don't think foreigners are going to have major stakes in China anyway. Because China has indeed worked out that opening in a way that when it comes, I wouldn't say it's too late, but basically for us it's very hard to compete. And I'm not saying it's only because of constraints, it's just because of the sheer amount of innovation and kind of internal competition that exists in China in many, many sectors. And I would, of course, also insist that within that, we also have to remember that there is a major role of state-owned companies that make also private companies' life difficult in China, let alone foreign companies. So the combination of all of that, in a way, allows China to open up. Now, why is then China kind of retrenching? I'm talking about here like concepts of self-reliance that we hear in China all the time. Why is China kind of, if I'm right to say, never mind, just open up, it's not going to be as harmful in terms of what you may lose to the rest of the world. Why is China increasingly reluctant? Because it's been pushed to the corner. And the elephant is in the room, I don't even need to mention. I guess everybody understands what I'm saying. And that's, I think, where the European position comes to play here. Europe has been trying very hard to offer a proposal for WTO reform to many countries in the world, including China. China has its own views about the transition period needed for China to adapt to that new WTO spectrum. But frankly speaking, if the US doesn't help Europe engage China in that reform, it's going to be very difficult for Europe to make it. And I think that's essential to solve the current problem. The other one is that Europe, in our humble world, increasingly so, I must say, we are pushing for something very important for China, which is underreported, which is a bilateral investment agreement. Why is this important? Because this agreement is not coming from a table with the G2, one forcing more than the other and, in kind of a cornering situation. It's coming from a true negotiation, which started in 2013. And this negotiation is putting on the table market access, reciprocity, and increasingly competitive neutrality, which the Governor Yigan knows very well, which I think is a very important concept for China to develop, which basically has in mind the idea of bringing to an equal footing private companies in China and state-owned companies in China, and thus anybody else who comes to play, foreign companies included. So this bilateral investment agreement, to me, could shed some light of how we can engage with China on an equal footing without really, if I may say, threatening China with any kind of tariffs or any other means. And that could set the scene for a WTO reform in terms of the behavior of SOEs, subsidies, and this competitive neutrality at the core of that discussion for other countries to come. So I'm just saying that I hope that these European efforts are taken seriously and that we're not seen to weaken the negotiations, because that would defeat the purpose even for China. Because this is, in a way, the way out. It's about reform without being imposed upon. It's an equal basis negotiation. And that's why I just want to emphasize the importance of this ongoing negotiation, which hopefully will be finalized soon by the new Commission. So that's all I have to say.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay, thank you very much, Alicia, for your comments on the opening up and also on the European-China relationship. But it's amazing, no, that the WTO and the global trade rounds have sort of ceased to function, and now we have to go through this bilateral pattern of engagement, which is clearly suboptimal, maybe better than other alternatives, but certainly not the best place, but maybe the only game in town at present, unfortunately. We'll come back to discuss opening up issues later on, but now we're going to go to Cheng, who's going to, I think, make his comments with the help of some visual aid.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Jose, for allowing me to use slides. It is a little bit helpful. I mean, with these graphs, I'll show you just not many, but a few. First of all, I have to clarify that, since I work for the Federal Reserve, I need to declare nothing here I say represent my employer's view. It's all my own. Especially this blackout period, I have to be careful not to comment on monetary policy. China is great. It's an issue that I can talk about. So I'm going to focus on structural reforms in China. If you look at this figure, you see where China was in the 80s when it started the reform and opening up. And the horizontal axis is GDP per capita in PPP terms in US dollar, and the vertical axis is the average growth rate for each period. In the 80s, China had a very low per capita income, but growing at a rate around 10%, and 90s again, 2000s, etc. Now, China had a per capita GDP about 13,000 US dollars in PPP terms in 2017. And this trajectory of growth followed pretty much what Japan and Korea have gone through in a similar period. They both started with low per capita income, Japan in the 60s, Korea in the 70s, and then they grow into rich countries, but in the process of growing richer, growth slowed down. That's a natural process, I would argue. And if you look at China, it followed pretty much the trend line. The dark line is the trend line I draw based on some third-order polynomial. If you look at 2017 China, you would hope, one day China would catch up with Japan or Korea in 2017. And so the question is whether China can do that. Is it going to keep growing at a healthy rate, even if it's slower, or is it going to stay at this middle income trap with a rapid slowdown? So this is a question of very high importance for policymakers, both in China and elsewhere in the world. Given that China now is 1/5 of the world economy, it accounts for 1/3 of global growth. So in order to maintain further growth, even at a moderate pace, China, I argue, needs to address several structural problems. It has gone a long way in reforming its domestic economy and opening up in the past 40 years, but more needs to be done. And focus on three structural issues here. The first issue is state-owned enterprises. They are traditionally a way for the government to help provide public goods. Like the workers don't have adequate unemployment insurance benefit or retirement benefit, so the SOEs will keep them employed even though they're running a loss by doing that. So it's like a public goods provision. And they also help implement China's industrial policy. If they want to target certain area like a high-speed rail, 5G network, or infrastructure, then they ask SOEs to do that. So SOEs have this multitask feature. They have to achieve all these other goals. They have to keep operating, even they're less efficient than the private firms. So overall, it presents a drag on growth. And reforming SOEs is certainly one of the important issues facing the policymakers. And the second source of structural distortion is the financial market. In China, the financial market is highly distorted in the sense that the banks are required to lend to SOEs at subsidized interest rate, and in return they have to raise the interest rate they charge for productive private firms, so hurting those firms, reducing the credit allocated to productive non-SOEs. At the same time, banks have to depress the deposit interest rate they pay to the households just to break even, because they are required to subsidize lending to SOEs. This causes financial repression and distort the household's intertemporal consumption saving decision. And that's another source of distortion. The third source of distortion is the external capital account controls. It is, China has done a lot to open up the capital account, but it has been a gradual, I would argue, it's a slow process. It is, in a sense, necessary to support the financial repression, because if the household receive a very low deposit interest rate, then they have every incentive to invest abroad. So the domestic firms will not be funded properly, so the banks will lose their customers. And then capital control is one way to prevent that from happening. So I'll skip these charts and go to some logical reasoning. Here is a high-level type of description. It's based on some recent research work. China is never interested in a big bang reform, like doing this, eliminating all the distortions overnight. They want to do it gradually. Then, since there are multiple sources of distortions, the issue is where to begin. What is the first place you want to start? And for example, when you think about opening the capital account, Alicia was talking about opening up. And if you think about opening capital account, you have to worry about the potential adverse consequences on the domestic financial system, since you have a distorted financial system. And in the recent work with my colleague Mark Spiegel and student Jingyi Zhang, we looked into this trade-off involved when China is trying to liberalize its capital account. And with financial repression, the SOEs borrow at subsidized interest rates. Private firms have to pay higher market rates. Households receive low deposit interest rates. So you have this distorted financial system. Then say when you allow the foreign investors come in, the foreign capital flow is happening, then they're going to compete with banks in the lending market. So forcing banks to lower the lending rate they offer to the private firms. But then the banks will have to pass through this cost of subsidizing SOEs to the households, depress the household deposit rate even further. That's going to lead to a bigger distorted consumption saving decision. On the other hand, if you open up the outflow, you allow the households to invest in the US market or elsewhere, then they will do that. But that's going to drain funding for the domestic banks in China to finance firms' operation. And that will lead to, that will hurt primarily the domestic private firms. So that will be a reduced productivity because it misallocates resources to SOEs. So this trade-off illustrates the tension involving liberalizing capital account without financial reform. Based on this, I argue that financial reform should be pursued ahead of capital account liberalization. So this is a gradualism approach. And similarly, before you liberalize the financial market, you got to worry about the source of distortion. Why do you need financial repression? The source of the problem is the SOEs need to be subsidized. And the financial repression is just the consequence of subsidizing SOEs. If you liberalize a financial system without reforming SOEs, in a different study, we find that this will cause even more overinvestment in the SOE sector and worsen the resource allocation. So you should reform SOEs before liberalizing the financial sector. And essentially, this is what I want to argue. But structural reforms are needed to sustain future growth. China still, is at a crossroad. There's still large room for further growth if these distortions can be properly addressed. But in order to pursue these structural reforms, China needs to think carefully about the sequencing, what to do, where to liberalize first. And this SOE reform seemed to be the source of the problem, and it seemed to be the top priority. But again, because China doesn't really have this social safety network, SOEs are asked to provide public goods in that way. So I think this involves first building up this social safety net. The government should, provide better unemployment insurance, better health care, so that they can rely less on SOEs. That's going to help to think through the sequencing of reform. The gradualism, it is a necessary consequence of this multiple sources of distortion. I'll just leave there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Cheng. And maybe we can come back later to the issue of the order of liberalization, where I think you made some interesting points, maybe a bit controversial, but we can come back to them. James.
Nice slide about Japan and Korea. And you notice what Zheng was saying about, Korea did this path, Japan did this path, and then China was still here. Do you realize what it means if China continues on that path for the global economy? Let's just play a thought experiment. Today, Korea is 50% of US GDP per capita. Do you think it's reasonable that in 40 years, China might reach 50% of US GDP per capita like Korea or mainland China's compatriots in Taiwan? Anyone disagree with that? Think it's really unlikely? I take that as a no. That would mean China will become twice as big as the US economy. That would mean in a generation, China's not just the biggest economy, it's the biggest economy by a long way, and you have US plus the Eurozone, is still going to be dwarfed by China. That is a change in the global gravity that we've never seen before. Just think about that. At the moment, China's 2/3 of the US GDP, and it's already creating issues and opportunities, I'd argue. But think what it's going to be like in a generation's time, when China is the economy, when Mr. Frankel says, I had to talk about US, I had to talk about West Germany, I had to talk about Japan. Now the conversation, even within the IMF, when we have conversations about what's happening in the world, people usually start with me. So James, what's happening in China? And then we carry about the rest. In a few years, there's not going to be a lot of rest to talk about. So I just want to put it out there, just what it means. That if you all think China's going through this path, it means the world as we know it from a global point of view, and this is about the Bretton Woods Committee and Reinventing Bretton Woods, will be very, very different. So what does that mean for us as policymakers? It speaks deeply to some of the things that we take for granted. It speaks to trade, it speaks to capital markets, and it speaks to institutions. Now, trade, as you may have noticed, China already, at only 2/3 of US GDP, is creating challenges to the global order. What will it be like in 10, 20, 30 years when China is by far the largest economy? When China is importing a very different basket, when China is exporting a much more highly value-added basket, how will that work? And the rules of the game are not fit for purpose. The international trading system has served the world very well, including China. And if it's going to survive, it will need to change. China will need to change, as Elisa said. It will have to open up its service sector much more to international firms. And the international system has to change. We have to start incorporating services, e-commerce, intellectual property. This system we have is not fit for purpose. It needs to change. Capital markets. China's integrated in trade. You all know that. It's the opposite on capital markets. Brad showed and Kristen showed some IIP graphs. China is grossly underexposed to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is grossly underexposed to China, as Jiang pointed out, because of capital controls. That will change. Governor Yi Gang is moving quite rapidly to open up the capital account in China. Portfolio flows, especially, are being liberalized quite rapidly. At the moment, China has the second largest equity market in the world, and the third largest bond market. And what's foreign participation in it? 3%? 4%? Tiny. That will change. The exchange rate is now becoming much more flexible. Its internationalization is increasing by the day, and it's getting characteristics of a reserve currency. All this will continue. That means that everybody else in the room who works in other countries will have their capital markets and their exchange rates much more exposed to what happens in China. And thirdly, speaking from a personal point of view, what about institutions? What about my institution, the IMF? Well, I can tell you that the shares, the quotas as we call it in the IMF, have not kept pace with the changes in international environment, especially for countries like China. And if the IMF is continued to have its role that its members want us to have, its global reach, its resources, that does not seem to be possible unless we give a representation appropriate to their global importance to countries like China, their voice in the IMF and their share of our voting power. And lastly, what about new institutions? China is participating in existing institutions, but it's also creating its own institutions. You've all heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is also huge. We could be talking $1 trillion. Organizations like mine talk about infrastructure gaps in the world. Suddenly, China could fill them. And it's creating its own institution. 70 countries already signed up. And that creates great opportunities for the global environment, for the global economy. It could also create challenges, of course. If this is not well managed, we could also create sustainability challenges, and China doesn't fit neatly into the institutions that have been created so far, like the Paris Club. If debts need to be rescheduled, China isn't a member of the Paris Club, so it's not easy to make that process happen. So I just want to put out some challenges out there from what we will see as in the future from China.
Okay, thank you for these points and for introducing the Belt and Road dimension, which is something that other panelists may also want to cover afterwards. So having done this first round, let me just ask you if you want to react to anybody else's comments before I start shooting a few questions to all of you. Is there anything you want to say about anything that the others have said that strikes you as not perhaps consistent with your own thoughts, or that you want to qualify or comment on?
Well, just perspective of time, as you properly said. We are talking about a relatively short period of history during which China started, and the West was interested in China because it was a low-cost place to produce. That's in the past. It was a large market. The second phase was that the rising cost already came in, and China was thought more as a partner. The third one When China developed even further, it started to be thought of as a competitor. The next one, when it did so well, it started to be looked at as a rival. And the next one, when it did even better, it transformed itself to become an adversarial relationship. And given the sizes, that's the worst place to be. And that's why we need the framework within which competitors, partners, adversarials can all fit together. 2008, in London, in the height of the crisis, which is the only way in which governments get their minds focused, brought together and made good decisions about changes the quota share of China and many other kind of things. It took years before the start of implementation because the feeling was that the crisis is over. So you're absolutely right that the concept that led in the American Revolution, the notion of no taxation without representation, should also apply to many of the things that have to do with the international system. The AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which you mentioned, indeed is a good example. It probably would not have been born if China had its natural role in the existing organization. But by and large, it's a very good development because, as you said, infrastructure is the key for growth, but it better be done in the proper way. And finally, the Belt and Road system. So many countries are afraid of it because they see it as a political arm of an imperialistic aspiration. I really think of it as an unbelievable opportunity of bringing together the true mechanism for globalization. But it has to be governed in the proper way, so not by all the time suspicion, but rather creating the framework. And now that it is still young, $1 trillion worth, still young, is the time to bring together. And frankly, the trade talks would be much more productive if one transformed the issue of tariffs on soybeans to issue of intellectual property rights and how to govern the Belt and Road.
Very good, very good. James, I wanted to come back to you on the issue of liberalization and the sequencing. And I wanted you to offer your views, or the IMF views, on the right sequencing. And what we had from Cheng is that we have first reform and liberalize the state-owned enterprises. Then financial reform. Financial reform has been going on for quite some time, and it's been accelerated recently. And then opening up of capital account liberalization. And in a way, the three things have already gone to some extent in parallel. So I wanted to know which is the updated thinking of the fund in these moving parts and the relative speed at which they should be advancing going forward in order to foster sustainable growth and financial stability.
Well, Jose, I think you know our arguments, and it was very much in line with the presentation. Our view is that first you fix your financial system, and then you open it up to the rest of the world. So the general approach being taken by China seemed very appropriate to us. We think the work's not done. China's made a remarkable improvement in its financial supervision and regulation, as you know, in 2017, 2018. There's still work to be done. The credit growth is still very strong. We still have a number of weaker, smaller banks. And of course, there's still, in a way, a lot of savings that may be looking for a home elsewhere. And I think there's a structural issue about lending to state-owned enterprises that will need to be fixed. But then I think there could be a faster movement on capital account opening up. But we've always, strange enough, at the IMF, been quite cautious in giving advice to China on opening up its capital account, that it may not be in China's interests, we don't do it prematurely, and certainly from the rest of the world's perspective, the last thing you need is to be overly exposed to China's financial sector if it hasn't been properly reformed.
Thank you. Alicia.
I'd like to add, I very much like your sequencing. I just want to remind the audience that you added a very important point, which is the welfare state. So you basically create a welfare state, private, public, depends on your resources. We saw the IMF augmented fiscal deficit. We have our own. It's not as large, but it's pretty large. So The point here is, do you have the room to create that, especially public welfare state, to then reform your SOEs, to then liberalize your financial sector, and then open your capital account? And I think I would actually add one more reform before you basically create a welfare state, which is indeed market access. So the capital account is one thing, but FDI is a different thing. And I think China could start by basically opening up the service sector, in itself already creating an equal playing field with competitive neutrality perhaps as a concept to use. And there, when you already have competitive forces, I think by then you can actually do this. Because I think the constraint on the budget, if you look at what China actually spends, and this economic affairs in China's fiscal accounts, which look very big to me, it's not easy to find the subsidies, but you can see that there is a very unbalanced structure of the fiscal expenditure in favor of economic production as opposed to welfare. And I think you really need to get competition before. Then I'm not sure how many resources you may have. You have to go maybe private insurance rather than all public, because it's going to be very expensive. And then only then, I think you can do this. So I would argue that market access, and is actually desperately needed to engage with the rest of the world, because that's part of the issue, could be the starting point for this sequencing that you were referring to. Yeah.
Okay, Jacob?
One more point on sequencing. There was a period much before the China Fed, the lessons from Latin America. There the lessons were, as you said, first fix your own home, own house, and in this context it was have a good fiscal system so that you do not need to distort the way in which you finance the system. Then you open up to the rest of the world, and again, in the sequence being first in the trade area and last in the financial area after you have done everything else. One of the reasons is, like always, the cost of mistake. If you do a mistake on the capital account, it comes back and punishes you extremely quickly, like financial markets do. So you better have everything else in place. There is, however, one issue to remember. The problem today is that the area that was supposed to have been already open by the Article 8 of the IMF, and which is opening up the trade account, that's the area that is being challenged today in the various protectionism. The area that we made progress already with the capital account, now the IMF condones capital account management. In the old days we called it capital controls, which is a problem. Let's face it is a problem. And I can understand in the short run doing things, but let's make sure that the compass tells us where we want to end. And as long as we want to end with fully liberalized financial markets because the system is sufficiently robust, then at least we understand that deviations from it is not losing credibility. It's not a new paradigm, but it is a detour. And final remark about the WTO. You said something that the West is a little bit disappointed, maybe with China. Disappointment is on both sides. Indeed, in the original time, when China was admitted to the WTO, even though the system was not fully ready, the hope was that the very admission will be having the property of virtuous cycle. It will catalyze good policy measures. It turns out that the WTO now is viewed more, what does it restrict, rather than what it catalyzes. And that's a general issue about, it came up also in the discussion of the EU with Turkey. Namely, there was no chance that Turkey will join, but the EU was holding the carrot in order to improve policy making in Turkey for a while, but then it did not work either, etc. So that's a general issue.
Okay, well, the issue of capital flow management has been debated very heatedly inside the fund for quite a number of years with very different views, but maybe we're putting James on the spot if I ask him on that. I'm going to ask you something different, which is about the spillovers of the US-China trade tensions. And this is something that the fund has quantified in terms of the impact on the global economy, and it's already taken a toll. But you have gone beyond that, and you have done a very sort of fine analysis of what the implications are in terms of global supply chains, in terms of Asia versus Europe. Could you share for the audience the main conclusions of your analysis on that issue, which is very important?
I think the main conclusion is there's no winners from this, really. I think under one scenario, Mexico could come out slightly up, but apart from that, pretty much everybody else loses, including the US in the longer term. In China, of course, bears the brunt of it, but over time it will reorganize itself and import from elsewhere. Countries that supply China into the China global value chain will suffer, and countries that supply China's consumption demand, like New Zealand, will also suffer as a result. So we find quite far-reaching implications. But just picking up what you said before, it's hard to get very big numbers coming out of the data. You know, you can fine-tune this and you can cut it, and you can make, we can get 0.5 of global growth if tariffs go to 25% and everything. But, you know, it doesn't scare people very much. But we all know if the co-pilots are fighting, it's not good to be in that aeroplane, and that's the problem which we're struggling a bit, that we can do all this kind of analysis, we can show it's got negative consequences, but we also know that globalization has driven the prosperity of the global economy for the last 20 years, and if you take that engine of growth away, or even put it into reverse, that's a much deeper and more structural threat than I think just pure numbers can ever show.
Very good. Jen, coming
Yes,
back to you now.
I think the discussion about these recent headwinds is catching everybody's attention because the trade war and the trade uncertainty and other things, it is a symptom. It's rather reflecting the concerns about the global economic order. You know, there's a global slowdown of growth. China is slowing, US, Europe, everywhere is slowing. And this is a good point of reflection. We need to try to understand what is the ultimate source of sustainable growth for China. There are plenty of discussions about other countries, advanced economies. But for China, traditional view is, China has this cheap labor in the early years, and then, it's able to develop fast because it has an advantage of cheap labor. But if you look at the real growth accounting, like you look at how much is the overall growth, say the 10% of GDP growth is driven by capital deepening, driven by labor, schooling, education, stuff like that, and the rest is like the total factor productivity growth. And in the first 30 years at least, 1/3 of the growth of GDP growth comes from total factor productivity. And starting after the global financial crisis, that fraction of GDP growth accounted for by TFP is substantially smaller. It becomes less than a quarter, maybe 20%. So there's a big slowdown in productivity growth. And then you have to think about what went wrong, what can be done to keep the TFP keep growing. And this opening up, integration into the world is important because China can learn from the rest of the world, the frontier technology, the management practice, and so on. But in my view, and based on my own research, I think there's big room in China's domestic economy for improvement. There's as showed in the discussion, in the presentation, that SOE is really a problem of misallocation. A lot of credit and capital is allocated to the government favor sector, not necessarily explicitly owned or controlled by the government, but some firms that are connected to the government, or like infrastructure, heavy industry, they're favored by the government. This favoritism towards less efficient sector is really a big distortion that keeps the productivity, low. And you could liberalize that source of growth. You can drive growth for a longer time if you pursue the right reform. So this is, I'm sure Governor Egan and his team have thought long about these issues. It is when you have many distortions, you have to figure out think very hard what to do first. So,
Alicia?
Very quickly on this point, I'd like to add that, and your presentation, you were talking about SOE reform, then financial reform, but actually SOE reform includes bank reform, because for many, if you really actually look at China's banking sector and you categorize joint stock commercial banks, city commercial banks properly, given the role of local governments, it's basically state-owned for all what matters. So in other words, it's not only about liberalizing rates, which lots has happened already in China. It's really about the ownership of the banking sector, which builds into the way monetary policy can actually work. In other words, it's not only about misallocation, it's who is misallocating. And to the figures that we heard about how big China might become, which I'm sure scares many in the audience, but I'm very aware of, I think we need to remember that China's banking sector is already massive. It's about $40 trillion US. And that's of the size of what we consider to be very large, i.e. Europe's banking sector with what we've learned about it. Yeah, we don't have a spare wheel. And I think for China, with an income per capita of, what, 12,000, something like that, as you showed, with bank assets of the size of Europe, imagine how they will be when income per capita is that of Europe. So that humongous banking sector with the current ownership, given the misallocation of resources, can only, what I'm trying to say is not only SOEs, it's the way they're fed that should call for reform in ownership in the banking sector, even before you even talk about probably anything else. And that, again, brings me to market access, role of foreign banks, but it's going to be very hard for any foreign bank to even get there, given the size. And that in itself is a big problem, in my opinion, for China today. Where to find the private forces in that banking sector that kind of settle it down to a size that is reasonable for China and the world.
Good point. Let me ask you a question before we turn to the audience, which is a question which goes beyond the trade tensions between the United States and China, and which has implications for globalization. And in the first panel, there was an allusion, I think, by Christine to something which is very important, which is that we have seen already in recent years a fragmentation of globalization. Well before the US-China conflict, there's been fragmentation, particularly in the financial sphere, but still globalization has more or less continued. Now we have a real risk. I don't know if it's a tail risk, a significant risk, of going to a sort of splitting up of the world into two spheres of influence as concerns globalization, some sort of bifurcation of the road that we have traveled together so far, between the China sort of focus sphere of influence and the US sphere of Israel, the East and the West. If you think of international companies, both financial and non-financial, which do business on both parts of the world. Think, for example, of Daimler, Mercedes. They export a lot to the United States. They export a lot to China. Think of JP Morgan, Standard Chartered, big business in the United States and in China. Think of geographic areas like the European Union. It has very special relationship with the United States from the trade and financial point of view, but increasingly so with Asia, and particularly with China. Think of particular countries like Singapore, which is very much linked to the United States on security, military issues, and to China from an economic point of view, and to many others. So the question is, how do you see that risk that we're going to a different world, where globalization is going to be fundamentally different from what it is now? How important is that real risk? And how could we cope with the consequences if it materializes? Because I'm not very sure. I'm not very sure of what can we do in a world which has become so interlinked if you try to extricate these interlinkages. and whether these existing interlinkages are some sort of a barrier for this bifurcation to take place in the first instance, even if there is a political will to do it, because it's just in the nature of the beast that you cannot unplug these things which have been unplugged so tightly through history. So these are the two views that I have, and I wanted to ask you about that, because I think it's a question which is dramatically important for so many agents in the world, and now is a top concern of many places, both in the private and in the public sector. Jacob, would you?
Well, we are in an era in which politics and economics are as intertwined with each other as it ever has been. And it is the source of both danger and opportunity. The concept of globalization is following the logic of economics. The concept of fragmentation follows the logic of politics. Political processes may bring about fragmentation because of the natural thing. And when politics and economics join hands, globalization and fragmentation get into a clash. And here comes the point. There was a time, the previous decade, say, or millennium, that globalization was on the winning horse. And a lot of stitches were made. And you are absolutely right. To undo the stitches is very, very difficult. And the point is that not all of us must discover America. It's enough that some have discovered it. We know what happens when the system is very closely integrated. So even allegedly small units, Lehman, can bring about huge outcome because of the interconnectedness. We know what happens when you follow the political logic of the fragmentation. Just look at Brexit. Brexit is a vivid example for the statement that the problem of a political suicide is that you live to regret it. And indeed, how do you undo that? So I think that rather than going on this road and discovering it time and again, it will be helpful to take all the examples that you can take from creation, and people from Lehman onwards, we are still vivid, to see how difficult it is to disentangle. And there have been some efforts, and some successful. Some countries disintegrated, some countries, we have so many that have disintegrated. Some in a peaceful way, some in a less peaceful way. Look at it a little bit. I think that whenever the financial sector was very, very interconnected, it was very difficult to have a divorce. It is true for individuals, and it is true for countries and for systems.
Very good. Okay, maybe it's time that we turn now to the audience so that we can get a few questions before we get finished. So please. Second row, if you can bring a mic.
Thank you.
It's fine. It's working.
It's fine? Yeah, thank you. So you haven't touched very little or almost nothing on technology.
Could you raise your voice a little bit more? The audience here is not that great compared to there.
Thank you. So you haven't touched very much on technology. And this is one phenomenon that links a bit to this issue of fragmentation you were discussing before, and the sequence of reforms. Because of course, you have this parallel technological cycle in which you have also dominant players, and in which you can have systems interconnected. Like you have Huawei with these American apps and whatever, or not. So in that sense, is any sequencing of reforms consistent with not ending up in a polarized or a fragmented, let's say, technological or digital system?
Who wants to take that up?
Well, I had to. Of course, this is one of the most important issues. It starts from property rights. And with the development of technology, it creates two things. First, it's more difficult to defend the property rights. That's why we are talking more about the culture rather than the legal system, because the culture is the thing that determines it. And I really think that at the end of the day, the outcome will be all or nothing. And if you say that the outcome is all or nothing, then the cost of giving up the all is going to be prohibitively high. And, but that also means that violators should be very, very, very severely punished, and the rules should be enforced. Otherwise, we are destroying our infrastructure. The issue of information, who owns the data, what abuse can be happening to the data, that's it's very difficult to overcome it once you fall into a trap. The entire system of the financial system hinges on credibility, on private information, etc., and it will be a disaster if not.
Good. Over there.
Thank you. Very interesting discussions. I'm Paul Graham from the Danish Central Bank. So I have a question. So you're talking about this internet connectedness of the global economy, and sometimes it sounds like it's a problem. So shocks can translate or can move from one place to another place. So it makes the whole world more fragile. But you could also see it as it's diversification, so it makes the world more robust. I mean, the amount of shocks that you have been putting the world through with trade wars and Brexit and so on, and we are still standing. So that sort of tells me that there's something more robust, and is that perhaps the globalization?
Alicia?
Yeah. Well, I can't agree more, and I'm going to take the opportunity to also address the other question in the sense that, thanks God, we're integrated. Because if we weren't, given what's happening, it could have been much faster to see basically China, imagine taking the decision to really believe in the self-reliance, given that, in my humble opinion, China has been cornered. So given its size and its opportunities, they could take that road and just say, why not we have some alliances for resources, which is basically one of our bottlenecks. But the fact that that level of integration is already very high and is very costly, in a way protects us from worse scenarios. And this brings me to technology. I think the fact that, in my humble opinion, China still has some gaps, especially in semiconductors, is also an insurance device, because it forces China, or it pushes China not to go full into self-reliance, because it's just not possible. So the idea, first, that we're integrated, second, that we're not yet there in terms of technological catch-up in every sector, is in a way, to me, a blessing in the current circumstances.
There are really two issues. You spoke about the world full of shocks and all the rest, and it will only make us stronger. I think that there is indeed a sense of optimism in what you said. There is a division of labor. There is an ocean, and the ocean is stormy. There are boats, and the boats must withstand the storm. And there is a division of labor. Those in charge of the boats must make the boats as robust as they can. But there are also those in charge of the ocean above, in addition to God, which is make sure that the system generates less storms. Given that there are storms, make sure your boats are strong enough. There is an issue, however, in the world of externalities. When there are externalities in public goods, it's not clear who is going to do what, and that's where there must be attention given to it. In the area of cyber, for example, at the present time, there is no legal infrastructure that connects countries other than it's more relationship between private sectors than there is no international code of conduct. In the area of health, in the area of pandemics, in the area of climate change, those are par excellence areas that require international cooperation because of the externalities that are involved.
Thank you. There was a question there, and then Liliana.
Thank you. Usman Manding, I'm with Accenture. I have a question regarding these imbalances. One factor that you have not mentioned, and I think is key to understand these imbalances, is the asymmetry we see between the real world and the monetary world. And the fact that China now is the second largest economy in the world, yet its currency plays no role in international transaction. I see this as one of the most important challenges that the world is facing, namely the orderly integration of emerging market currencies into the international monetary system. If you could comment, please.
Thank you. Who wants to take that? Cheng?
Yeah. The capital account liberalization and exchange rate policy liberalization, it should be tied together. You can't go one without the other. If you control the exchange rate, say artificially make it either stronger or weaker, then the consequence is a capital flow, inflow or outflow. And the central bank, needs to accommodate the inflow or outflow under the current regime. They have to either build up the foreign reserve or run down on it. So you're right. I think in the long run, if China will become the largest economy in the world, then its currency should elevate. It should become one of the important world currency. At this point, it's still far from that, partly because its financial market is not integrated into the world. And this goes back to the sequencing problem, because China is doing this gradually, is liberalizing capital account gradually for concerns about financial stability issues, given that it has a distorted financial market at home. And so in the short run, I think it is going to be a delicate challenge for China to figure out to what extent it should liberalize exchange rate. The worst case is just to create this exchange rate devaluation expectation. Then it's going to lead to abrupt capital inflow or outflow. Either you let it go, this is not a gradualism thing. RMB liberalization should be done suddenly and completely, or you keep managed, floating. So it is a sequencing of reform, again, is an important issue here.
That's not something that can or will happen overnight. We look at the history, the rise and fall of world currencies is really part of history. For a long time it was pound sterling, then it became the dollar, but we have some glimpse during the Vietnam War. Suddenly the role of the dollar started to be questioned. The dollar did not lose its hegemony, but this is the time when de Gaulle spoke about the exorbitant privilege, and the high inflation of the US was a warning sign, which they brought about. They put their house in order with all of the right things of the strong financial system, culture of law, and all the rest. And then the euro came in, and gradually the euro gained ground, not to replace anyone, until the great financial crisis, which stopped that process. So by and large, the US is and will be the leading currency of the world, and RMB will obviously come in a very gradual way, but let's not expect to see the RMB to displace anyone in the near future or in our lifetime.
Thank you, Liliana. And this will be the last question.
I fully agree with the order of liberalization that have been discussed, and Jacob reminded of the episode of Latin America. Actually, at the time I was at the IMF writing papers on capital account liberalization. My question is that China really has an incentive to reform, given its current path of a slowdown. After all, SOEs have been used to expand credit to support growth. So China seems to be facing an important trade-off between financial stability and growth. But if it takes too long to actually resolve the issue, it may be like it happened in the past, lose both financial stability and actually exacerbate further the slowdown, like all other emerging market economies that have happened through this cycle have experienced.
Thank you.
So the SOE is tradition, as you said, the government relies on SOEs to implement fiscal stimulus policy to stabilize the economy, or as I argue, it also provides public goods in a sense. So in order to implement this policy, you can't go let SOE all be privatized overnight. And we need to keep in mind that SOEs exist for a reason, that the government does not have this adequate social safety net, and then they rely on these SOEs to do the work. That calls for a deeper reform, like establishing welfare benefits, establishing this retirement, healthcare system, in order to, lift the burden of SOEs, let the efficient ones keep operating, but the inefficient ones be privatized or merged with other more efficient ones. I don't know if China's policymakers are thinking about this, but something along the line in the late 90s, like Zhu Rongji implemented a large structural reform of SOE sector. That really improved the efficiency of this, surviving SOEs, and that propelled some of the productivity growth in that period. But the consequence is lots of people working for SOEs lost their jobs. They're laid off, and that led to a lot of social problems. To address your question, I mean, more deeper reforms in the welfare system needs to be implemented before they dismantle this SOE.
Okay, I think that you've had the last word in terms of the panelists. It's time to conclude. I will just say that my main conclusion from this session is that, as you can see, we will have to continue talking about China for a long, long time, because it's not only fundamental for everybody else in the world, but it's likely to become even more fundamental as time goes by. So let us thank the panelists and do that with a round of applause.